What reparation looks like to me for all blacks on the earth, regardless of who held your suffrage papers. This is not just about you. This is about all blacks who came before you and who will come after you. Part 6 of 6. When we speak about reparation, we must make selections that keep on giving. Monetary compensation. Monetary compensation for our ancestors' person and free labor is something that goes without saying. We must stipulate that monetary amount should be evaluated based on what slaves and slave labor would be worth in today's currency. The cost of slavery. The history of slavery of African and Black American people in North America lasted for 157 years under the colonial rule of the English and a further 89 years under the rule of the United States government, a total of 246 years of slavery in North America, which had led to the establishment of the abolitionist movement and the Civil War. Slavery was eventually abolished by the 13th Amendment that was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and ratified on December 6, 1865. Well, we're going to hear about this because we know it didn't work out like that, like they're trying to make it seem, right? Most assessments start with the notion of payment for lost wages. One researcher took 1860s price for slaves as an estimate of their labor value and applied compound interest. The results, $2 trillion to $4 trillion, 6 generations after slavery demise. Perhaps the issue needs to be looked at differently. One way is to recognize slavery as an institution upon which Americans' wealth was built. If we take this view, it is not important whether a white family arrived in 1700 or in 1965. If you wear cotton blue jeans, if you take out an insurance policy, if you buy from anyone who has a connection to the industries that were built on chattel labor, then you have benefited from slavery. Likewise, if you are black, regardless of when your ancestors arrived, you live with slavery's stigma. Extending the reparations argument this broadly frees one to move beyond the issue of loss of wages and seek out other factors on which to base a formula. If there were one statistic that captured the persistence of racial inequality, it would be net worth. The typical white family enjoys a net worth that is more than 8 times that of its black counterpart, according to the economist Edward Wolf. Even at equivalent income levels, gaps remain large. Among families earning less than $15,000 a year, the median Black American family was a net worth of 0, while the corresponding white family has $10,000 in equity. The typical white family earning $40,000 annually was a nest egg of around $80,000. Its black counterpart was about half the amount. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Become a frequent visitor of Hobby Money. This inequity is partly the results of the head start whites enjoy in accumulating and passing on assets. Some economists estimate that up to 80% of lifetime wealth accumulation results from gifts from earlier generations, ranging from the down payment on a home to a bequest by a parent. If the government used such net worth inequality as a basis and then factored in measures like population size. It could address reparations by transferring about 13% of white household wealth to blacks. A two-adult black family would receive an average reparation of about $35,000. In particular, in 1860, there were nearly 4 million slaves, and their average market value was around $800. But what does that mean? How much would that be in today's dollars? The monetary value can be measured by a transaction when something is bought and sold, or as an expected value of an asset currently held. Some assets have value because of the potential income they can generate. An example would be a piece of capital equipment, such as a cotton gin, for which planters would pay to have their cotton processed, or a slave who would pick the cotton. Other assets may have value because of their potential resale value, such as land or a rare painting. The owners of a painting choose to have part of wealth invested in something that does not generate current income, either because of an expectation that it will appreciate or because they wish to consume the pleasure of owning it. These assets also may give their owner status and power. Owning a Rembrandt painting gives one bragging rights among art collectors. Owning half of acres in the county gives one lots of influence in local politics, regardless of whether the acres are in production or not. The demand for a slave is a derived demand, as is that for any productive resource. It is derived from the demand for the output that resource helps to produce. There was an active market for slaves throughout the antebellum period, meaning that slave owners believed the purchase of a slave would prove to be a profitable expenditure, even though the expenditure required a considerable amount of money. The time the South seceded from the Union, the purchase of a single slave represented as much as $150,000 and more in today's prices. This was twice the average of 14 years earlier, indicating a sustained growth in the demand for slaves. Economists would say that these observations alone indicated that the profitability of investing in a slave was increasing substantially. Why would a slave have so much value? A short answer is the value of a slave is the value of the expected output or services the slave can generate minus the cost of maintaining that person. For example, food, clothing, shelter, what have not, over his or her lifetime. A quick list of the data that have to be considered in determining the value of a slave's expected revenue would include sex, age, location, how much he or she is likely to produce, a factor that included a slave's health and physical condition, and the price of the output in the market. For a female slave, an additional thing to consider would be the value of the children she might bear. In addition, there is considerable evidence that slaves were worked harder than free labor in the southern agriculture. What slaves could be induced to produce in bondage was greater than what they could be expected to produce with the freedom to make their own choice of labor or leisure. As these outputs and costs are in the future, they must be discounted to their present value. So an owner must choose a discount rate. And as they are in the future, there is uncertainty in determining what they are. So the present value of the slave is an estimate made by the current owner. In general, Most economic historians believe that slavery was profitable, even at these expensive prices. The price of slaves vary with respect to age, sex, and location during the antebellum period. As one can see, prices were higher in the South than in the Old South, in the New South than in the Old South, the states along the Atlantic coast, and higher for males than for females. The statistics on slave prices shows that healthy young adult men in the prime of their working lives had the highest price, followed by females in the childbearing years. Young adult males had more value as they were stronger, could work harder in the fields, and could be expected to work at such a level for more years. Young adult women had the value over and above their ability to work in the fields. They were able to have children who by law were also slaves to the owner of the mother. Old and infirm slaves had low, even negative prices because their maintenance costs were potentially higher than the value of their production. Similarly, young children had low prices because the cost of raising them usually exceeded their annual production until they became teenagers. Those who have researched slave prices have discovered that a large number of additional variables went into the determination of the price of any particular slave at a particular point in time. A premium was paid if the slave was an artisan, particularly a blacksmith, plus 55%, a carpenter, plus 45%, a cook, plus 20%, or possessed other domestic skills, plus 15%. On the other hand, a slave's price was discounted if the person was known to be a runaway, negative 60%, was crippled, negative 60%, had a vice such as drinking, negative 50%, and was physically impaired negative 30%. In general, the discount for each of the slaves was slightly larger for females than for males. The prices presented above are average prices for the slaves transacted in a given year. A person studying their family's history might come across a notation that a family member purchased a slave at a given price, or that a family member purchased their freedom at a given price. Without information regarding these details, it is difficult to interpret what the price of a single slave means. This is the average price of slaves over time in current dollars. This is the labor income value of owning a slave in 2016 prices. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Become a frequent visitor of Hobby Money. What is the comparable value of a slave in today's prices? None of these prices has much meaning to us today, but they would if we revalue them in today's dollars to the amount of money slave owners spent 150 years ago. The techniques developed in measuring worth have created 10 measures to use to compare a monetary value in one period to one in another, as explained in the essay Measures of Worth. Of those 10, 3 are useful to discussing the value of a slave. They are labor or income value, relative earnings, and real price. Using these measures, the value in 2016 of $400 in 1850, the average price of a slave that year, ranges from $12,500 to $205,000. The $400 price in 1850 represents the expected net value of the future labor services a slave would provide. This embedded meaning is why the labor or income value is the correct measure of the value of a slave's services in today's prices. That $400 would be $92,000 in today's prices. While some slaves were rented out for farm and other types of work, most slaves worked on the farms and plantations of their owners. In both cases, the work they did was mostly unskilled, so a comparable measure of the value of these services is reflected in the unskilled wage. In other words, they can assume that to hire a free employee to do the work of a slave would cost the unskilled wage of that day. Thus, a measure of the average value of a slave would be the present value of the net rental cost over the life expectancy of the average slave. This may go over a lot of your head, but don't worry about it. As long as who is representing knows it, we understand this. The value in today's dollars of a slave during the antebellum period ranges from $50,000 in the 1809 to $150,000 of a slave's expected revenue less maintenance costs. If we assume, for example, that the average slave will live 20 more years, then today's price for a slave value at $400 in 1850 would be interpreted as the $92,000 in wages plus the 20 years of room, board, and clothing it would take to hire an unskilled worker today to perform the lifetime services expected of a slave. And we know there were no board, clothing, and room and all of that they saying, because we know how the slaves were treated. They were dressed in rags, they were living in plywood, pieces of plywood thrown together, and nothing was offered to them. Unlike hired hands, slaves were responsible in large part for producing their own room, board, and clothing. Given that the work week today is significantly shorter than in 1850, and that slaves were made to work harder during the same amount of time as free workers, it would take more than one hired hand today to replace the labor supplied by a slave back then. Even at these prices, some slaves, particularly those with artisan skills, might ultimately earn enough to buy themselves out of slavery. It was not uncommon, especially in the Old South, for masters to allow others to hire the services of his or her slaves. This was particularly true of slaves who live in urban areas, independent of the master. They were expected to make their own arrangements. The master fixed the wage that the slave must bring in. All above this amount, the slave might keep himself. Employers frequently hired the slave's time from the owner at a certain amount and paid the slave an additional wage contingent on the amount of work accomplished. This is the relative earnings of owning a slave in 2016 prices. The relative earnings, the 400 average slave price in 1850 can also be thought of as a signaling device of status in a period where the annual per capita income was about $110. Relative earnings can be viewed as the ability to purchase expensive goods. Today, the middle and upper middle classes aspire to goods and services such as a second home, servants, and an expensive car as a way of showing others that they have arrived. that they have achieved some status in the economy. The average slave price in 1850 was roughly equal to the average price of a house. So the purchase of even one slave would have given the purchaser some status. Comparisons based on relative earnings are measured by the relative ratio of GDP per capita. Consequently, $400 in those days corresponded to nearly $195,000 in relative earnings today. And they mean 2016, not 2019. Real price. Economists commonly use the real price measure when they are trying to account for the impact of inflation. The real price today is computed by multiplying the value in the past by the increase in the Consumer Price Index, CPI. The result compares that past value to a ratio of the cost of a fixed bundle of goods and services the average consumer buys in each of the 2 years. In the construction of the CPI bundle, an, an effort is made to compensate for quality changes in the mix of the bundle over time. Still, the longer the time span, the less consistent the comparison. In the 19th century, there were no national surveys to figure out what the average consumer bought. The earliest budget study used by economic historian was of 397 workmen's families in Massachusetts and was constructed in 1875. These families spent over half their income on food and rented their housing. The measuring worth calculator shows that the real price of $400 in 1850 would be approximately $12,000 in 2016 prices. We all can identify with what that amount of money would buy today, but hardly anything we would spend 12,600 on today was available 160 years ago. $400 in 1860 would have purchased 4,800 pounds of bacon, 3,000 pounds of coffee, 1,600 pounds of butter, or 1,000 gallons of gin. It is unlikely, however, that this was the budget of the typical slave owner. Most of the food would be produced on the plantation, and housing would have been buildings constructed by the owner and his slaves. The opportunity cost of the $400 for the slave owner would have been supplies for the plantation, or perhaps luxuries and travel. Using the real price is not the correct index to use for measuring the value of a slave's labor services in today's prices. It does, however, give an idea of what the cost of purchasing a slave was in 2016 dollars. Thus, just before the start of Civil War, the average real price of a slave in the United States was $23,000 in current dollars. If you don't have a hobby, find a craft that you like. There are a host of crafts available to you. Find out who needs what you produce with your craft. There's always a need. Sometimes people don't know what they need until you bring it to them. Become an expert in your craft by learning everything about it. The more you know about your craft, the better you can exploit it.